When you pick up the Bible and just start reading from the beginning, it doesn't take long before you come across something that people will point out as a major contradiction. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are claimed to have two creation accounts that contradict. For example, in chapter 2, man is created before plants and animals, and woman is created at the very end. But in Genesis 1, plants and animals come before the creation of humans, and man and woman are created together in the image of God. Many people just consider this to be a blatant contradiction, while scholars look at this and see these two accounts as contradictory because they come from two distinct and separate creation accounts from different sources that were later stitched together by a redactor. But there is plenty of evidence that Genesis 1 and 2 were always meant to be together as one unified narrative, and the claims of contradiction fall apart when scrutinized. Welcome back to the Word Room, where we make difficult Bible passages make sense. This is the sixth video in a series of videos on this channel about Genesis chapter 1 through 3, and addressing the arguments that people make that say these chapters are inconsistent with reality and science and other claims. If you have not seen the first 5 videos in this series, you're still going to be able to understand this one, but I encourage you to go back and watch the other ones as well. They cover everything from Genesis 1 not being about the material beginnings of the universe to what is the image of God. Links for that playlist are in the description below. So what about the connection in these two chapters? Do they contradict? Are they two different accounts stitched together? Let's talk about it. So let's look at the first problem. Genesis 2, 1 through 2. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the seventh day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. This is clearly a continuation of what we see in Genesis chapter 1, finishing out the 7 days of creation. He had already created, or in Hebrew, bara. You can see video 4 in the playlist to see what bara actually means, but he had already created, or barad, plants and humans. But now look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. No shrub of the field had yet grown on the land, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not made it rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Wait, so now we are going backwards to no plants and no humans. So this must be going back and retelling the story, right? But there's a problem. What comes after doesn't match. In Genesis 2, the order is different. In chapter 2, verse 7, God creates man. Then in chapter 2, verse 9, God creates plants. Then in 2:19, he makes the animals. And then in 2:22, he makes woman. But in Genesis 1, the order is, in 1:11, God makes plants. Then in 1:20 and 24, he makes animals. And then in 1:27, he makes man and woman together. This is clearly a contradiction, right? Well, no. But to understand why, we can't just cherry pick a couple of verses out of chapter 2. There are verses in chapter 2 that give us a clear indication that chapter 2 is not a retelling of the creation story, but rather it is a sequel to it. First, let's go ahead and deal with the claim that these are two competing accounts that were stitched together. Without getting too deep into the weeds here, many scholars have argued for what is called the documentary hypothesis. This is the idea that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were stitched together by 4 other sources to make what we have today. The Yahwist or Yahwist source, sometimes called the Jerusalem source, the Elohist source, sometimes called the Ephraimitic source, the Deuteronomic source, the priestly source, JEDP for short. The scholars who argue for this documentary hypothesis are the scholars who argue that the two creation stories of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were competing stories from these different sources that got stitched together. By the way, you should know that there are plenty of scholars who reject the documentary hypothesis, and that's a growing number of scholars. Those who hold to the documentary hypothesis break Genesis 1 and 2 up this way. Genesis 1 through 2:4a comes in from the priestly source, and Genesis 2:4b, the second half of that verse, all the way through chapter 3, verse 24, comes from the Yahwist source, so the P source and the J source. It splits Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 up this way. Genesis 2, 1 through 4a. Thus, the heavens and the earth were finished, and all of the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created. And then it stops the source there and then splits it up and says that starting at the end of verse 4, it starts a new source. In the day that the Lord God had made the earth and the heavens, and every plant of the field before it was on the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. So the first source ends with, these are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, referencing back to the 7 days of creation. And then the second source starts with, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now here's the problem. Splitting these up like this doesn't work because it breaks up a clear chiastic structure in the text that would have been intended, and because there is a toledoth here. Let's start with the chiastic structure. A chiasm is a literary device that involves repeating words, phrases, or grammatical structures in reverse order. It's also known as inverted parallelism, or an ABBA pattern. And this pattern is in verse 4. Let's look at it. Verse 4 starts with an introduction, these are the generations, and then we have our ABBA pattern. So these are the generations, A, of the heavens and of the earth, B, when they were created, B, in the day that the Lord God made, A, the earth and the heavens. You can clearly see that ABBA pattern. Heavens and earth, created, made, earth and heavens. These were intentionally written together to make this pattern, meaning they can't come from different sources. And this emphasizes the continuity between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They were intended to be taken together. So what did I mean about the toledoth? The Hebrew word for generation is toledoth. And the phrase, these are the generations of, appears multiple times in the book of Genesis. And it actually divides up the book of Genesis. Genesis 6:9, generations of Noah. Genesis 10:1, generations of the sons of Noah. Genesis 11:10, generations of Shem. Genesis 11:27, generations of Terah. Genesis 25:12, generations of Ishmael. Genesis 25:19, generations of Isaac. But here is the key. This phrase is always used in all these other verses to introduce the descendants of someone or what comes after the person. Now we have this phrase used in Genesis 2:4, but in Genesis 2:4 the phrase is not used of a person, but it's used of an event. The generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. But the same logic applies. It is describing what comes after, meaning that what follows comes after the 7 days of creation. Genesis 2 is focused on a specific geographical region rather than being focused on the earth in more general terms as in Genesis 1. Now, why do people assume that Genesis 2 is a retelling of Genesis 1? There are two primary reasons. The first is that many believe that Adam was the first human, and as a result, the humans of Genesis 1:27 cannot come before Adam is made in Genesis chapter 2, if Adam is the first human. I will address that claim in a future video, so if you haven't already, click that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, because you don't want to miss that video when it comes out. But the second reason is related to some of the phrases in Genesis chapter 2 that many people misunderstand. Genesis 2:5, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. This verse seems to imply that there were no plants. And since plants were made on day 3 in Genesis 1, this has to be a retelling, right? Wrong. Notice the language of verse 5. Yes, it speaks of every plant of the field not being in the earth. But first we need to understand what the word earth means. In English in the 21st century, when we hear the word earth, we tend to think of the planet. But in Hebrew, the word used here is eretz, and that word simply means ground or land. Specifically in context to Genesis and the creation story, it speaks of dry land. You can see that in Genesis 1:10. And this word is often used in the Old Testament to speak of a local geographical regional area. Here are some examples on the screen. Feel free to look them up. And there are countless more. So when it says there are no plants of the field in the earth, it doesn't have to be talking about the entire planet. On top of that, the context of Genesis 2 seems to focus in on the specific geographical region of Eden. Genesis 2, 8 through 15. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted, and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison. That is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. So Genesis 2 is focusing on a specific geographical region on the planet, not the whole planet. This frames the usage of the word earth in verse 5 as being a part of a specific geographic region. But there's more in verse 5 that gives us even more detail. It doesn't just say every plant or every herb. It adds the phrase of the field, and then adds at the end of that, there was no man to till the ground. The word field in Hebrew is sadeh, and it can refer to a cultivated field. And the addition of the phrase, there was no man to till the ground, gives us insight that this is not talking about all plants, but rather cultivated crops. Scholar John Walton says, regarding the role of Genesis 2, 5 through 6, we note that the plants referred to in Genesis 2, 5 are qualified so as to indicate that they refer to cultivated crops rather than general vegetation of Genesis 1 available to the gatherer. And this is further seen in verse 6, Genesis 2, 6. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. The Hebrew word for watered here is sakah, and it either means to give a drink or to irrigate. It means to give a drink or to drink when it's speaking of animals or humans, but it means to irrigate when speaking of plants or vegetation. Here are some examples on the screen. So if Genesis 2:5 is saying no plants are there at all, then what is the water of verse 6 irrigating? So this is actually not contradicting Genesis 1, but rather is focusing on a specific geographical location that had no cultivation at the time. So what about the animals? Doesn't the animals being made in verse 19 show that there were no animals prior to this? Well, no. Let's read verse 19 together. Genesis 2:19. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Now we have to remember the context here. The context of this verse is in a section that is zoomed in to one geographical region, Eden, not the whole earth. So even if this was the physical creation of new animals, it would not be animals across the whole planet, but rather just animals in a specific garden for Adam to name. But let's dig a little deeper to see what's happening here. This statement about the animals comes in a larger narrative and point. So let's look at it. Genesis 2:18 through 24. Then the Lord God said, It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper corresponding to him. The Lord God formed out of the ground every wild animal and every bird of the sky, and brought each to the man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the livestock, to the birds of the sky, and to every wild animal. But for the man, no helper was found corresponding to him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to come over the man, and he slept. God took one of the ribs, it's actually the Hebrew word side, and closed the flesh at that place. Then the Lord God made the rib, or side, he had taken from the man into a woman, and brought her to the man. And the man said, This one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, for she was taken from man. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh. Reading the full context here, we can see that the larger context of this statement about the animals is actually about man and marriage. So let's examine what is happening here. God starts this by saying it's not good that man is alone, and God is going to make a helper corresponding to him. And then we get this statement about the animals being made and Adam naming them. But then we get this statement. But for the man, no helper was found corresponding to him. The statement about the animals being made and then named is connected to looking for a helper for Adam that corresponds to him. This is about God revealing to Adam that the animals are not suitable to be this helper, and that God had a different plan, marriage between the man and the woman. But if this is God just wanting to bring the animals to Adam to show that they are not enough to satisfy his need for a helper, why does it say God formed them? Formed the animals? Did he make new animals here? There are two potential answers here that are possible, and I will explain which one I hold to in just a moment. But first, is it possible, linguistically speaking, that this text is saying that God specially materially created a few individuals of the various animal and bird species for man to name? Yes, linguistically that is possible. These would have been sufficient to help the man understand his need for a helper that corresponds to him, rather than a helper like one of the other animals or birds. God could do miracles, and this could have been a miracle he did. And this would have no bearing on the way the other animals outside of the garden came into being. But this is not the most likely answer to the question, in my opinion. Some scholars argue that the first verb in Genesis 2:19, formed, should be rendered as a pluperfect verb or past perfect verb, had formed. This is why many translations in the English today use the phrase had formed rather than formed. There's a list of several scholars who hold this view on the screen for you to go research and look up. I'm not going to go into a full Hebrew lesson here. You can look up those scholars to see the grammar and why 2:19 should be rendered had formed. But the key takeaway right now is to understand what is happening in Genesis 2:19. Translating the verb as a past perfect implies that this account refers to God's previous creation of animals, and therefore is not a new creation. So what is Genesis 2:19 saying? God had previously formed animals at some point in the past, and now is bringing the animals into the garden for Adam to name, and highlight how they do not qualify as a helper corresponding to him. Genesis 2 is not contradicting Genesis 1. It is not a retelling of Genesis 1, but rather a sequel to it. The plants being mentioned are about a lack of cultivation in a specific geographic region. The animals are not being made at this time, but it's referencing a previous forming of animals. This is not a contradictory second creation account. So what does it mean that God formed them out of the ground? What does it mean that Adam was formed out of the dust of the ground? That is the topic of the next video in this series. Until then, check out this video where I talk about talking animals in the Bible, or this playlist where you can watch all of the other videos in this series. I'll see you next time.